parallel session on the margins of the 65th CSW session. I'm delighted to be your moderator today. My name is Salma Al-Rashid, the Chief Advocacy Officer at Al-Nahda Society in Saudi Arabia and the head of the Saudi Arabia delegation to the Women 20. Today's event will aim to discuss effective measures to accelerate women's full and equitable participation in decision-making in the public, political, and private spheres in the Arab Gulf region, the GCC. We're delighted to be joined with experts from the region. Our experts will tackle sociocultural barriers that risk hindering progress, as well as shed light on policy change, role of public and social structures in advancing the narrative, social perceptions and changes in gender norms and expectations, transparency and monitoring. Before we start, a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this event is being live streamed on Al-Nahda's YouTube channel. You can find the link in the chat box. If you're joining us through the NGO CSW platform, I would like to invite you to utilize the chat box. Tell us where you're joining us from and post your comments and questions for our speakers. We will have a 25 minutes Q&A session at the end of this event. It is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today, Rasha Al-Turki, Al-Nahda's CEO. Rasha's career interests revolve around the goal of positively contributing to Saudi Arabia's development, with a particular interest in women's empowerment. As CEO, she initiated and oversaw the execution of 2 strategic plans, as well as the implementation of the Oracle ERP and CX management systems. Previous to her role as CEO, Mrs. Rasha served for over 3 years as Al-Nahda's Chief Projects Officer, where she oversaw the running, development, and evaluation of Al-Nahda's projects in the fields of financial, education, and social development, professional and vocational training and employment. Rasha is a founding member of SILA, a women's professional network aimed at empowering professional women in Saudi Arabia. In 2016, she was appointed by royal decree to the Board of Trustees of the Human Rights Commission, where she served on a part-time basis. Mrs. Al-Turki holds a BA in history from Wellesley College and an MA in Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard University. She has done extensive research into the history of female entrepreneurship in Saudi Arabia, and I have the pleasure of working with Rasha for many years. Rasha, the floor is yours to give the welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Salma, and hello everyone, and welcome to Al-Nahda's first side event at the CSW. We are very proud to be here with you today. I'm very pleased, and I would like to take a couple minutes to share with you why. Since the founding of Al-Nahda Society in 1962, it's been committed to the socio-economic empowerment of women and the activation of their role in national development. Over the years, it has remained nimble, shifting its activities to address the issues that are most pressing for women to effectively interact with the rapidly evolving surrounding context. The past year of life in a pandemic has only further strengthened our belief in the importance of putting women's unmet needs and aspirations at the center of our programming to fulfill our strategic goals for an equitable society. Al-Nahda aims to offer a model for civil leadership in economic development, research, and advocacy, both locally and internationally. In addition to Al-Nahda's hosting of the W20 in 2020, receiving ECOSOC consultative status in 2019 allows us to spread our activities beyond Al-Nahda's domestic efforts and to contribute towards women's inclusion globally. Coming together with women from across the globe will allow us to learn from each other and work together towards common goals. Ensuring environments, public and familial, that appreciate and fully value women's decision-making abilities is one of Al-Nahda's goals that will be informed by the topics shared in the CSW 65. Through this side event today, we hope to contribute to this conversation and are very pleased to have a wonderful group of women and a gentleman who will be sharing their expertise in different subject matters and from a number of geographical locations. We thank them for their time and their dedication. We are also grateful to all our participants who have taken the time to join our event and who we hope will ask questions and share learnings, thereby enriching the conversation and overall experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rasha. I'd like to invite participants to follow and share their insights on today's discussion on Twitter and following Al-Nahda on social media. You'll find Al-Nahda social media accounts in the chat box and the hashtags for this event. It is now my pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Mr. Issam Abu Sulaiman, the World Bank's Country Director of the GCC. He has been the country director of the GCC since August 2018. Mr. Abu Sulaiman, a Lebanese national, joined the bank in 1989. His most recent assignment was country manager of Colombia in the Latin America and Caribbean region. Having started his career at the World Bank in the loans department, he has since held various positions across the institution, including head of financial advisory and banking at the World Bank Treasury, and principal investment officer in the banking and debt management department. His regional expertise includes Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East regions. Mr. Abu Sulaiman is a graduate of the Harvard University Executive Management Program and holds an MBA in Finance and Investment from George Washington University, as well as an MBA in Management from the American University of Beirut. Issam, it is a pleasure to have you with us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Salma, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening everywhere you are. So it's really a privilege to be among these accomplished ladies today. And look, I can't talk about everything that I have in my mind on this subject, but I want to emphasize few things during my note, and really it's related to the economic and the development of the GCC and how important the woman factor is going to be in all of this if the countries are to achieve actually their vision and the development objective that they put for themselves. So I'm just going to give you a framework of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start by talking about the wealth of nations, the human capital aspect in that, the education part of the human capital, the women labor force participation, and how all of this will create how important it is to create the ecosystem for women to incentivize them, protect them, and allow them equal opportunity in the workplace. And at the end, I'm going to end with some of the lessons learned from our own involvement basically in this subject, especially in the GCC and what we have learned that's important for the successful creation of the ecosystem. So let me start by the wealth of nation. In 2018, the World Bank has put in a major report out there. It's called The Changing Wealth of Nations. And if I want to summarize it in one line, the conclusion of it is that 2/3 of high-income countries' wealth is its human capital. Okay, so remember this number: 2/3 of the wealth of any nation in the upper income or in the high income category is its human capital. And that's an important perspective. Why? Because in the GCC, if we take an average, the human capital represents only 1/3 of the wealth of the nations in the GCC. Of course, in the GCC, we have a lot of underground wealth, but we also don't have half of the population fully immersed in the economic and productive activity, which is a woman. So imagine basically if we have half of the population involved basically totally in productive activities, the wealth of the GCC, how far up it will be. So when we talk about the human capital, we had another World Bank development report 2 years ago, and it created basically what we call the Human Capital Index. And the Human Capital Index, all MENA had scored very bad. The GCC is not different. So as a human capital, from a human capital perspective, the part that came very low for the GCC was the education and learning side. And that's for all the population. And that's important. Why? Because it is important because in the GCC on average, what we realized is that people graduating from high school will only achieve, based on their learning potential, around 57% of their productive potential activity during their lifetime because of the lack of good learning in the schools. And education is extremely important. Why? Now we have a different aspect of it when it comes to women. Women in the GCC, what our statistics have shown, are more educated than men. In all countries of the GCC, they're either equally with the same number of university degrees, or of the countries, the stock of degrees are more held by women, university degrees more held by women than men, 4 out of the 6 countries. The more basically we looked into these numbers, new graduates from universities are by far more women than men. By far. I mean, it's not a small difference. The gap is growing with the years. So you have basically a major impact on the economic growth, on basically the development of the GCC, the more we allow basically equal opportunity for women to get engaged in the economy and to include more women in the economy. And if you have asked me like 3 years ago, what is needed, I would have told you in 6 countries, you will need a lot still. You need to have the good legal framework, you need to have regulation, you need to have a lot of different things to be able basically to make sure that women feel comfortable, feel incentivized basically to get into the job market, to open their own business, to be protected from harassment, to be protected from, being sent home if they get pregnant and so on and so forth, and also being protected after they finish during their pension. No, I mean, so a lot of things. However, and this is basically where things have started to differentiate. Today, I cannot say this about the 6 countries. 3 of the 6 countries have made major stride over the last 3-4 years, especially in creating the right legal framework and regulation. And I have to take out here 3 of these 3 countries' names. I mean, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain. Especially Saudi Arabia and UAE. They have made tremendous effort in changing and reforming the legal framework of what I just mentioned. The protection of women, incentivizing women, and also basically allowing women equal opportunity in a lot of different places. If you start from mobility, for example, allowing women basically to get out of home, choose where they want to live, have their own passport, travel without any permission, all of this, which is important basically to go back and forth from work or to travel for business or anything like that. Protection on the job, from harassment to pregnancy and so on. And equal opportunities in all type of industries and so on. So these are like legal framework that has changed. It's not sufficient on its own. The 3 countries have gone basically and educated, informed, allowed basically a lot of the social media, and also put the right regulation, changed whatever is needed in the way that government as well as private sector has started basically to treat the recruitment and on the job basically treatment of women, and that allowed. Let me quote one thing here, which was very when we looked at the number, especially over the last 3 years. The Saudi Arabia number of women labor force participation. 2017, that number was 15%. 2020, our number shows a little bit over 30% women labor force participation. This is almost doubled in 3 years. It's still low in international standard. However, it's a huge increase in just 3 years. Of course, this is not only related to the laws that they have changed. They have done a lot of other things also to help women basically either being trained or to open their own business or to increase, the participation of women in a lot of different parts of the government, as well as the private sector. Let me also say a couple of things related to UAE, which I think it is important when we look at women leadership here. And I think the UAE is something to look for, to learn from, of how they are improving the leadership perception of women. So first, they have 8 ministers, almost 25% of their cabinet women. This is important. This is important as a signal. And it's important for young girls, when they look up, they see, women are in leadership position. And that's extremely important. The other thing, and it's just last week, UAE decided basically to have all listed company to have at least one director woman. That's also a big signal. It's a start. It's something basically that, a girl today that is at school can look up and see, look, this is what is a possibility, So these are important from a regulatory and like opening the door. But I personally feel also that women, in a way, are becoming much more prepared than men in the GCC for the business, for employment, and so on. And I mentioned the number of university graduates. So what is needed basically is what I just mentioned. I mean, you need huge government reform-minded support on the legal side, but also to bring all agencies and ministries that has to do with women to be part of this initiative from the public sector perspective. But then you need also a huge campaign, because look, it doesn't matter. I mean, not only in the GCC and the rest of MENA, but I came from Latin America just before I came. It's the same thing. I mean, it's a macho mentality, man is a man, and they think that they can do it all, and that, for some reason they have the privilege to be in those positions. So it's not an issue here. I mean, I was reading in the Financial Times today that even on the S&P 500, only 6% of CEOs are women. So this is not an issue of the GCC. But there are 3 countries that have moved ahead in creating some kind of an ecosystem. I think the other 3 countries, which are Qatar, Oman, and Kuwait, will need basically to learn. And the good thing in the GCC is you have a nice platform, which is the GCC Secretariat, and you have a lot of nice connection among these countries. I think it's a platform that can be used basically for learning among the different GCC countries, and also to see where the pitfalls are, and where the issues could be, and how things could be accelerated. And that is extremely important learning. Now, few things that we learned also, and I put it in my op-ed in the National last month. I mean, what we learned basically for the ingredient of success. I'm gonna just not to miss anything. There are 3 main things that we learned as ingredient for success. One is a strong government commitments. The second is effective collaboration and cooperation among government ministries is extremely important. And the third, and this is extremely important, is the effective implementation. And in those 3, I have mentioned several things, of what government has done, especially, beyond just changing the laws, how they went and changed regulation, how they put explanatory note, for example, on the issue of personal status law, and how all of these has been explained. And this was extremely important for those laws, to be implemented in a way that is effective on the ground. And then the second part was the collaboration and cooperation among all the different agencies and ministries and so on in the government. And including in Saudi Arabia, for example, in June 2019, they established the royal decree the Women Empowerment Committee through a royal decree. And that was important because it linked all ministries together, and agencies that has to do with women. And they started basically not only seeing how they can improve the situation, but collecting data and information that is gender-based that could be important for policymakers in the future. And that is really important. And by the way, the World Bank is putting a new report only based on data and how important is data for development, but also for the new age of knowledge and digital economy and so on. So data on gender, disaggregated in a lot of different ways, is extremely important for policymakers. And then the effective implementation and the campaign of information that goes around. And that is extremely important for two reasons. One is to show what has changed, but more importantly, how it's being implemented and what is the benefit for the society and the economy that goes beyond women themselves being basically included in the economy. So I know I probably spoke a lot. I can speak much more on this subject. And I know that there are a lot of different facets of the gender issue and so on. But what I like to call it, actually, it's not gender equity or not gender equality. I would like to call it actually gender neutral policy, because if we want to look into the future, 10, 15, 20 years from now, it won't be anymore about equity and equality. It will be like a place where everybody feels that they can come in, contribute, be productive, be in an unthreatened environment, and have the opportunity basically to reach, their potential. And that's extremely important. If I look 10, 15 years down the road, that's what I see. And I see really that the GCC has already, in some part of the GCC, taking the lead, that has had a huge spillover within the GCC itself, which is great competition, by the way. It's very positive, but also a spillover in the rest of MENA and probably worldwide, given the nature of the leadership that some countries in the GCC have. And that's extremely positive. And I really salute all the courageous men and women who have taken that step, especially over the last 3 years, to make things and the ecosystem for women economic inclusion a real reality in at least some part of the GCC. And I hope that the other part of the GCC get inspired, and those lessons learned in Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain can also be shared very easily with the rest of the GCC. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isam, for the very insightful intervention and for setting the scene really for our panel discussion. And I think and I'm sure we'll see. I can't wait to hear from our speakers and discussants in a bit, because you've mentioned that legal reforms and legal framework regulations and reforms are not enough. It's not sufficient on its own. And we're here to discuss of how can we recognize these leaps and huge strides that have been done in the Arab Gulf region, but we know that that's not enough. What else? How can we accelerate that? What else needs to be done beyond the legal reforms? And that's what I look forward to hearing from our a great lineup of speakers for this moderated discussion. Welcome all. I will be mentioning the names, all titles respected. We have Dr. Al-Anud Al-Sharikh. I'm so glad that you managed to join us despite the technical difficulty. Mrs. Jawahar Asteri and Mrs. Aisha Al-Swedi. So we have Dr. Al-Sharikh from Kuwait, Jawahar Tahir from Riyadh, or Mrs. Aisha from Dubai. We're pleased to also have Isam Abu Sulaiman join the discussion, the discussion that will follow the interventions. Each speaker will be given 10 minutes to intervene. Following all speakers' interventions, we will take questions from the audience. So I do encourage our attendees to put their questions in the chat box, and I will be addressing these questions at the end of the speaker's interventions. Our first discussant is Dr. Al-Anud Al-Sharikh. Dr. Al-Sharikh is the director of Ibtikar Strategic Consultancy, leading political leadership and diversity training programs in Kuwait and the GCC region. She is chairperson of the Shayo award-winning campaign, Abolish 153, to end honor killing legislations, and a co-founder of Mudawi's List, a platform to support women running for political office. Her research won the Arab Prize for Best Publication in a foreign journal in 2014 and includes books such as The Gulf Family and Popular and Political Cultures of the Arabian Gulf States, examining the persistent importance of family and tribe in modern Gulf politics and society. She was awarded the Knighthood of the National Order of Merit by the French government in 2016 for her dedication to improving women's rights in the region. In 2019, she was named one of the 100 most inspiring and influential women in the world by the BBC. She is currently an associate fellow at the Chatham House MENA program and research fellow at Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Anud, we are delighted to have you, and I really look forward to your intervention and learning more about your latest project. So Anud, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Salma. I'm very excited to be back at CSW. The last time I was there was 3 years ago, but I am more delighted to be back with Al-Nahda, who I have a great deal of admiration for. So my intervention today is going to start with sort of the genesis of women's participation in decision-making processes in the Arabian Gulf. And I think the first demands for the inclusion of women started in civil society movements. So if we trace the beginnings of civil society movements in the Arabian Gulf states, we find that they are over a century old, having started in Bahrain and Kuwait before anywhere else. And they were mostly centered around charitable Islamic almsgiving. Today, we find that this number has exceeded 5,000 of the registered ones. There are many more that are unregistered. And these are the latest numbers provided from 2015. But we find that less than 5% of those that are registered actually focus on women. I think that the Pan-Arab movement widened the scope of civil society work to include social and political issues from the 1920s, and that's been ongoing since then. And those conversations, very much like Qasim Amin's earlier in Egypt, involved demands for better educated mothers so that the nation can rise. So it was from this premise of education needs that the first conversations on the situation of women started in the Arabian Gulf. Today, the work of civil society groups on women's issues, they revolve very much around this tension between government-led empowerment projects and grassroots feminism. There was a discussion that happened on the nature of Khaliji feminism last summer between myself and two young activists from the UAE and Bahrain. And the most of the back and forth was around this terminology, Wtmkeen and Nasawiyya, and some of these movements being government-led and government-blessed, and others being kind of more independent and therefore scattered and perhaps less impactful because of that. However, we can say that these different multidisciplinary groups, they are, even though they exist outside of government-funded NGO groups, this doesn't mean that they are incapable of action. So some of that action even crosses national borders, like the movement to grant nationality to the children of non-national women. So in Bahrain, it was جنسيتي حق لي ولأولادي, my nationality is a right for me and my children. In Qatar, the movement is called أنا نصف قطري, I'm half Qatari. The movement exists in Saudi Arabia and in Kuwait, and it's led mostly by unregistered groups such as Kuwaitiyat Bila Hudud wa Abna al Kuwaitiyat. And I can't, in good conscience, speak about young feminists or civil society movements in the GCC today without mentioning the nonstop action happening on the Clubhouse app, and this being a new forum for endless debates on the intersection of women decision-making and youth movements. But the virtual space and on the ground are separated, I think, by both space and time. So when we look at movements that coalesce around a certain point in time and that are needs-based, for example, like the Baladi movement in Saudi Arabia, which was around the first taste of political participation with the municipality elections. And it had well-known figureheads involved in it. And it was kind of a mix between a spontaneous grassroots movement and a registered movement. And we see that a lot of the spaces where women's participation are discussed tend to have this symbiosis between unregistered grassroots and registered NGOs that are very much the public face of the movement. And we saw similar suffrage-led movements in Kuwait, and not very or as visible in other GCC states. And as I said, it's mostly needs-based. And in a place like Kuwait, where more than 15 years after we got our political rights, our current representation in parliament is 0 as women. So this makes it very necessary to have movements such as Mudawi's List and others that try to fill the space in the conversation. Of course, women's movements in civil society were also part of Arab Spring activism, and there's also the activism of Arab and Khaliji women in the diaspora. And in my capacity as the chairperson of the Abolish 153 campaign and campaigner for ending violence against women, I can speak about current efforts in my country today to push through policies of zero tolerance for issues like honor killings, which have been abolished from the UAE's penal code just past November, and focusing on domestic violence with a law finally passed in our parliament last summer, and anti-sexual harassment movements taking the front line with the Kuwaiti Me Too movement, Len Eskut, I will not be silent. So from kind of this very exciting civil society space, I want to move on to the findings of Ibtikar's Women's Leadership in the GCC series, which ran from September to November of 2020. Over 10 recorded sessions where 43 participants ranging in age from 25 to 70 and covering a range of professional and personal backgrounds from all 6 states of the GCC shared obstacles and triumphs in getting into the decision-making process through their lived experience. Because it is my belief that the data tells one story, but it's the experience on the field that is the best indicator of what is working and what still needs to be changed. Although the final report is still being finalized, my partners at the Konrad Adenauer Institute and I are hoping it will translate into a publication later on. I feel that I can share some of the findings with this panel, especially that two of Al-Nahda's illustrious members contributed to the research series. So I'm going to conclude with 4 of the main findings for speedy and targeted inclusion in both the private and public sector's decision-making positions. So the number 1 finding was that across the board, there are needs for more quotas. Whether temporary or permanent, mandatory or incentivized, quota tracks are proven as a successful solution to guaranteeing women's immediate participation in economic and political decision-making. And I stress immediate because we don't want to wait forever for incremental change when we know we have qualified women capable of entering the fray if we can guarantee exponential change for them. Secondly, equality in action, which means the re-examination of curriculums, HR policies, legal provisions that do not espouse the mutual respect that true gender equality needs in order to flourish. Thirdly, the engagement of media platforms, whether they are digital or traditional, they have to become partners in changing the narrative around women as decision makers. And we have to change the laws in the media to forbid hateful or derogatory speech towards women. Lastly, numbers and indexes, both as a tool to engage policymakers, but also in assessing statewide progress. And I think that as we heard from our last speaker, it's very important to have credibility when speaking about progress in women's rights and women's inclusion, when you can show the numbers and you can show that the ranking in international indexes have moved up. So I will stop here and leave you with those thoughts. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Al-Anud, and really thank you for giving us this overview of women's movement and activism in the region, and really shedding light on these. I think it's a perfect way to move to our next speaker. But really, these findings of the work that you've done, these echo what Isam mentioned, echoed with what we're hearing now of the need for more quotas. I can't wait to hear from our upcoming speakers on what they think about that, equality in action, HR policies and curriculums, engagement of media, and the importance of sexist aggregated data, and assessing process and numbers. If we don't count, it doesn't count. So these are really important insights. Thank you very much. From Kuwait, we go to my dear colleague, Jawahir in Riyadh. And I think that's a perfect way to hook for Jawahir's intervention. Jawahir Al-Saderi is the director of Al-Nahda program for research. She is also a board member on the National Center for Social Studies and the Commission of Architecture and Design under the Ministry of Culture. Previously, Jawahir was a senior program manager at Evidence for Policy Design at the Harvard Kennedy School. She was also a researcher at the NYU Furman Center for Real Estate and Housing Policy. She also worked as a strategy consultant at Monitor Group, as well as held the position of investment promotion manager at the Saudi Arabian General Investment Authority, SAGIA. Jawahir is a recipient of a master's degree at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and a BA from Smith College. She also attended the Beijing Capital University in China. Jawahir, I'll give you the floor to give us some insight on Al-Nahda's work on national dialogues and the Takafu Index, and telling us the story of what indexes like Takafu can help us do on the ground. Jawahir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Salma, and thank you, Rasha, Isam, and Anud. I feel that the conversation is paved for me. I don't have to explain much after your introductions and your contributions. I will actually echo a lot of what you have said. To start, when discussing decision-making, النهضة intervenes at different levels. So it's not only about participation in political decision-making in terms of at the national level, but we like to think about it in terms of at a trickle down, even at the level of the household. But in my conversation, I will focus on economic participation, and I'll give two examples of Nahda's role in kind of pushing the conversation when it comes to women participating in decision making. The first example, or the most recent effort that we have done, is the national dialogues, which were carried out in parallel to the W20. And Nahda hosted the W20 last year. And as an outcome of the W20, all countries would agree on a communique that is agreed on as to what are the policies and priorities that the 20 countries advocate for in terms of women's economic empowerment. And so Nahda also led in parallel to that an effort to develop a local communique that expressed the priorities and gaps that we find on the ground that really that we present to the decision makers. And the themes covered were the same. So across both the W20 and the national dialogue, the discussion revolved around this inclusion decision-making, inclusion in labor, then the labor force, financial and digital inclusion, and entrepreneurship. Of course, decision-making really is a cross-cutting theme. It affects whether you are speaking from the perspective of financial inclusion or digital or labor market or entrepreneurship. You need leadership across. And the effort for the national dialogue was really amazing because one, it aimed to represent the voices across different parts of the country. So we went to the largest regions, Riyadh, Jeddah, and the Eastern Province, and gathered through roundtable discussions input from people who are experts in these areas, let's say financial inclusion, labor inclusion, entrepreneurship, digital inclusion, and so on, that have on the ground real experience, where they can speak to what are the issues and what are the gaps that need to be tackled beyond just legal reform. As Isam and Lanwood mentioned, that what comes after reform. And so that we've gathered their input, and the participation in these roundtable discussions reached about 100 people, but participation in the events themselves was more than 700 attendees. So the conversation and the engagement was substantial, and this is a continuing effort. But there was a report or a communique that came out that detailed our recommendations in terms of addressing women's participation, economic participation across these themes. And as I said, it's about legal change, but then also how do we encourage or address issues that fall beyond legal change. Once you change the law, how do you incentivize a change in practice, a change in, you change the procedures that are linked to the law and so on. And of course, as Isam and Dr. Anoud mentioned, how do we monitor our progress? So this report is appended with a mapping of all data that measures women's performance across these areas and highlights where the gaps are. And so we definitely advocate that there would be gender segregated data across all of these themes. And so we want to work with all the official sources that gather this information, that in many cases the data is there, but it needs to be published and with gender segregated. And if it's not there, then we need to start gathering it. So this is on the national dialogues, and the effort here is to say, what are the issues and what are the recommendations? How can we solve them? I want to add another effort that is also ongoing, but in the same vein, which is takafu. And this is, Salma, thank you for mentioning it too. Takafu, which means equal or equal opportunity, focuses on equal opportunity in the labor force in the private sector. And this is an effort that we have been doing to, on the one hand, become a source for measuring the gaps in the private sector. And we measure it across 3 areas. One is participation. What is the gap in participation across industries and across firm sizes? But then also, what is the gap in progression? How are women growing in the private sector at the same pace? And compensation. And our analysis aims to, we want to measure the performance. We want to understand where are the gaps and how can we explain them? Why are women excelling in some areas and why are they not in other parts? Why does the gap increase as the positions grow and women are lagging behind? And also, I mean, beyond making the data available and measuring it and creating kind of more evidence around these issues, we are trying to create some sense of competition. So part of this effort is that we not only analyze administrative data that we gather from the government, but we also carry out a survey across companies, and we try to assess what are the issues and what are the opportunities, what are the best practices that are happening. At the end of it, we share a report with the companies participating, and we show their performance against the sample to say that you're doing really well in this area, but you're averaging not so well in this part. So it kind of gives them a sense of how they're performing against their peers, whether it's within across the whole sample or within their industry that they're in. And I think this is very important because, one, we want to encourage companies that feel that they are ahead to realize that they can do more. The other thing is that we want to move the conversation beyond encouraging participation in the labor force. A lot of policymaking in the country is focused on increasing participation, but the reality is that Saudi women are not all uniform in talent. We have a lot of women that are beyond participation. They are gaining seniority, and we're seeing that their expertise and their knowledge is not really being reflected in the labor market. And just to give some numbers, we have less than 1% of women as board members in publicly listed companies, and we can do much better than that. So this is how we're trying to create a dynamic, competitive environment around women's participation in decision making. And I'm happy to discuss other projects, but I think I've given enough on this thing. Thanks, Salma.
Thank you very much, Jawahar, for giving us this insight. And yes, we will hear now from our next speaker, but then after that, I'd like to invite everybody, and Rasha as well, to respond to what has been presented so far and keep this discussion going. I'd like to, before I introduce our next speaker from the UAE, thank you very much for staying up late. It's in the evening for us in this part of the world, and it's actually even later for our next speaker, Aisha Aswedi. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Aisha Aswedi is the CEO and HR Policies Sector for the Federal Authority of Government HR in the UAE. Aisha has 20 years of excelling experience in public policies, HR, and career development. She has been actively involved in various HR forums, committees, and government initiatives throughout her career, in addition to being associated with numerous international agencies. Over the course of her career, she has developed and implemented various policies and procedures for the federal government and successfully led and handled many strategic programs with different national and international stakeholders. She's a member of many highly affiliated national and international organizations, such as the American Association of Human Resources, Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, the Institute of Leadership and Management, and is the editor and chief for the HR Echo magazine, the first bilingual published magazine in the UAE specialized in human resources. Aisha, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us, and I'll build on, or I'll pick up with where Assam mentioned about the economies that showed the most reforms in the Women, Business and the Law report out of the World Bank. The UAE and Saudi were among the top of that list for, I believe, 2 consecutive years. Al-Anud talked about need for quotas and the effectiveness of quotas, even if it's temporary, but we need that. And Jawahar also mentioned the importance of that we have women, we need to push for more women in leadership positions. But also Assam mentioned that UAE has a good example of having women in ministerial positions. So I'd like to hear from you on HR policies in the UAE. What has been done to really, and what effective policies and proactive incentives, whether it's quotas or else, to improve participation. So we look forward to your intervention. The floor is yours.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم. مساكم الله بالخير. Good morning and good evening, according to the different time zones that we are in. First of all, I would like to introduce myself to you. I always like to say that I speak on my personal behalf rather than any other status, and that's very important for me because when I speak from my personal on my personal behalf, I know that the policies that I was working on really touched base on couple of other issues or aspects in the UAE. It affected the women in a way or another. I'm not an economist, I'm not a gender expert, but or sociologist. So I need to make it very clear, I'm speaking from a practitioner perspective, the things that I saw, the data I dealt with, the people that I have consulted, as well as the reality that I went through over the last 20 or 23 years, to be more precise. It was very important for me from the beginning to understand one thing when I was part of any team which was involved in designing any HR policy in the country, that I need to understand always the context of UAE. And that's very important element when we design any policy. And I keep saying this to the team that I'm working with, and this is one of the important learned lessons that I've learned through my career. The context, it is good to know the benchmarks and the best practices, but it's very important and crucial to understand the context that you're operating with. It's good to know what the people are doing in Scandinavia or in Far East, but always get to know your culture more, because the context that you are operating in will always dominate or influence the policy that you will work in. Another thing, I think it is a must for our generation to understand as well the strategic priorities and focuses of the government. And I think this is very important role that the institutions, the NGOs, the families, everyone, any stakeholder in the GCC countries. And I will speak in particular about GCC countries because, and UAE in particular, because I know more about this place. If you get to understand the strategic priorities for the government, like for example, as we are moving this year to something called the upcoming 50 years in our history. So since our declaration back in 1971. So the upcoming 50 years, the leadership of the UAE made it very clear to us where they are going. So it is easier for us to go back to our families and tell our kids what they need to focus on when they study or where they pick the careers or select the careers that we want to move in. I know the importance of sciences, for example. And that's very important. I know the importance and the role of the women and where they can be crucial and where we can capitalize on their efforts. The strategic priorities is very important for the alignment of the population. And I keep saying this to each and everyone. If you don't know where your country is heading to, this is really a disaster. You need to understand it very well. I think this kind of alignment helped us a lot at an institutional level, at organizational level, as well as the civil society level, to understand very well where we are heading. And that helped us a lot in shaping the policy that we are talking about. For example, Isam touched base. I like what I heard from Isam about the Women Business and the Law 2021 report, which was, I think, launched recently. There are two main areas where I think public and HR policies played really a crucial role in just improving the performance of the country and as well the rank of UAE. The workplace, and basically we're talking about legislations as well as acts, as Al-Anud was mentioning, as well as the pay, the salary scale. Let us go back and think, what did we do about it? We made it very clear since 2013. We changed our salary scale in the UAE government, as well as, I'm talking about the federal level. And when I say federal level, automatically the local level, because you know we are a federal country, yani, the others will follow. So we changed the terminology employee in the HR law. So, and we stated clearly that the employee is directly linked to the tasks that this individual do or does in his work, regardless his gender. So we are talking basically about the performance. So that we worked on the setup of the mind of the individuals, of the community as well. And we made it very clear for them that your performance will be the only drive behind your promotion, behind your pay, behind your compensation and benefits. That was very, very important for us. Another thing, as part of this effort as well, the performance policy for the individuals or the employees in the government, the training and development policy, the succession policy, the leadership policy that Isam was talking about, everything is gender blind. It depends on the individual's potential and performance. The promotion of the individuals, I know how important is it for the people to think about it. So we made sure to revisit our policies, and we do this, by the way, from time to another. It doesn't take us 10 years or 30 years to go back and change it. We changed the HR law. We changed recently the labor law as well. So to make sure that the private sector gets to be in the alignment with the public sector. We came as well with recently the UAE government combated discrimination and hatred law, which prohibits all gender-based discrimination. And I think these are milestones and helped us a lot in just reshaping the direction of the workforce in this country. Saying that, during my experience, I've noticed that UAE government used actually two approaches to do that. First approach is the top-bottom approach, which the government used at the beginning, a few years back, and where the government acts like a guardian for the whole community, and where we use the quota, for example, as Al-Anud was mentioning clearly. Quota is very important. The president has used quota, for example, when it came to the parliament, the selection of the parliament. He passed a very clear law saying 50% of our parliament will be women. So he made it very clear to the public that that's the direction we are moving in. As well, there are certain sectors where the government starts to enforce women. And by the way, Isam, the number of parties, the number of female, for example, or the women ministers in the UAE is almost 30% of the cabinet. It is not 25%, so I'm correcting it. It's actually 29.5%. Another thing as well, we have certain quotas as well at certain level, such as judicial level. We don't have many judges. We have them now in place. Scientists. So there are certain sectors that we focused a lot actually in nationalization on the process of enforcing quota. Quota is very important, but I have something to say. Quota is not sustainable from my perspective. In the longer run, you need more like a sustainable approach where it is a bottom-up approach, where the community starts to select the right people without noticing their gender. I'll pick Aisha because Aisha is good. You know what I mean? So this is more sustainable way. Other governments recently, I've noticed other governments, they are going for another approach, which is shocking approach. That might be useful in under certain circumstances. By all means, what I would like to emphasize, two things actually. The importance of using KPIs, key performance indicators, to measure the success. This framework can be fantastic. You can put the best policies in the world, but if you don't have a proper monitoring system to check the progress, it will not work. Kiss the whole policy is goodbye. I need to be very clear with that. The KPIs is very important. And another thing, post-COVID, there is another player which we need always to consider. This player is the technology. And this player can be really a dangerous player, can change the whole rules of the rules of the game, and there are some consequences we always need to anticipate and just think about it post-COVID-19. We have technology will have a huge saying on that.
Thank you very much, Aisha. And you do touch upon many things that I'm sure our speakers would like to jump in and comment on or respond to. So please, I would like to invite our attendees to post their questions in the chat box. I do have a few follow-up questions, but before I do get into that, I'd like to ask our speakers if any of them would like to jump in and respond to any of the interventions and speakers that we heard today. Please feel free. I'll know you're ready once you unmute yourself or raise the raise hand button. So would anyone like to take the floor? Okay, then maybe I'll put someone under the spotlight. Aisha, thank you very much. You do touched upon and you provided context from a different angle, but really you did echo a lot of the things that were mentioned today. Quotas, the sustainability of this approach, the importance of political will, and recognizing the context of where we work. What works in one place might not work in another place, and understanding the importance of understanding that context. I'd like to go back to Isam. And Isam, I have a question here on, in your opinion, how do you think countries in the GCC can further involve men to push change and break down gender stereotypes? Because we do understand that we are in the region, there is this huge political will, there is this push towards encouraging women to enter the job market and all of that. But what can we, we can't do it without men, and we really need to have both sides. We need to have men's involvement, and we need to have. I want to hear your thoughts on that, and how do you think? What can countries in the region do to involve men to push for that change? Because you did mention that, regulatory reform is great. These policy changes are important, but they're not enough. I've heard each one of you mention that we need to dive deeper. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Salma, and really I learned a lot from Aisha Jawahir and Al-Anoud this evening. It's not only it's for my own benefit also that I stayed. I didn't want to do like 10 minutes of a talk and then leave. Look, there was a study by Harvard not long time ago about Saudi Arabia and men in Saudi Arabia and their perception of their wives going to work, no? And I mean, one thing in the study like drew my attention is that men in Saudi Arabia like their wife to work, but they're afraid of what their neighbor is gonna say or their neighborhood is gonna say about that. So there is a perception and there is also really what the feeling is out there. And I want to say also one thing is, you know, even inside the World Bank, you know, we have, before this latest wave of change that we are seeing, I mean, there is a huge socioeconomic transformation happening at different pace in the GCC, that's for sure. I mean, you can see it almost in every country today. And some of them have acted on it and turned it into laws and regulation, and some are still behind. And inside the World Bank, I mean, I have this same debate, you know, I said, no, but it's culture and religion and so on. And I said, no, it's not. So the perception even from the outside is very different than what you see on the ground and what is taking place on the ground. And the latest, especially the latest last 3 years of changes of laws have proven that, you know, all this perception of religion and law is just perception. I mean, you can't have more Islamic country like, you know, Saudi Arabia. I mean, that's where everything started, no? And that's where basically it's very important for the Islamic world. So this perception of like culture, religion, and habits and so on is very different from what the people are looking to do. And when you see this transformation and how people have reacted inside each country, it's very interesting that while you have different pace of transformation where it has started, the reaction, especially from youth of the countries and the women of the countries, has been huge in terms. I mean, of course, you always have in any country. I mean, I come from Lebanon. I mean, you have from the very liberal to the very conservative there, but they can all live together. I mean, there's no reason basically why a conservative people cannot live in a liberal neighborhood or like all together. So that part is very important to take that out of the people's mind, especially on the outside of the countries, and on the inside, definitely is very important. I mean, our global director of gender in the bank told me one thing, and she's a woman, Miss Crown, and she said, Isam, very important to work on men, not only in your countries, but all around the world, even in the US, basically on how this is an important issue to involve the whole human capital of a country in the development of the country. You cannot leave one part outside, because the biggest potential is when everyone is contributing to the development of the country. Let me stop here. I mean, it's fascinating, you know, when you get into it, but that's something I said at the beginning in my, it's very important, the communication part, not to only talk about the legal part and the regulation and how things have changed, but to talk about the benefit to the society and to the economy. And that is, I think, much more important, and goes a little bit, you know, the quotas are good and sustainable are good, but it's all about changing the behavior. And that behavioral change takes time and takes basically a lot of examples and communication and at all levels.
Thank you very much, Aisha. I see you unmuted, please.
Sorry, Jawahar, if you can give me a few seconds. I think what Isam was saying is very important. We need to have courageous conversations. Courageous conversations, I'll put it in this way, bluntly. Radical openness. We need to remember these two words. I think without having courageous conversation, we cannot compromise anything. This is very important. In UAE, we had it. And when we consult, even we do a consultation before launching or piloting any policy, and you can imagine the level of discomfort sometimes, or the disagreement where it reaches. But towards the end, this courageous conversation takes us somewhere. So we are UAE as a government right now is an outcome of these courageous conversation. This is number one. Number two, nothing wrong in acknowledging the fact that we cannot, that we are unable to negotiate. We need to learn how to negotiate the resources and opportunities. This is very important. And by the way, I know maybe some people will not like what I'm saying, but I learned this from men. Men, they have really a legacy when it comes to legacy for millions of years. They were there in the labor market millions of years before us, or thousands of years before us. They know how to negotiate. This is a skill, very important skill. All women should learn how to do it. By the way, the men make the deals in the night and they come in the morning and they share it. I learned this from one of the men. We shouldn't do it this way. I'm not saying this is the right way of doing it, but I think it's very important. It's a time to learn how to reach the win-win situation by learning how to negotiate the resources and the opportunities to overcome the challenges and to hunt those opportunities that we are seeing. Sorry, Jawahar, please take these words.
No, thank you. Actually, now I will comment both on Mr. Assam and Mrs. Aisha's contributions. Actually, Assam, one of the authors of the research you mentioned is with us. I see her in the attendees, Dr. Alessandra Gonzalez. She had collaborated with a couple of researchers to examine perception around women's participation. So they surveyed men and asked them how they felt about their daughters or their wives participating or working. And then they asked if they believe that society is accepting. And the survey showed that everyone overestimated how conservative society is or how resistant society is to women working. And so when they showed them the results, the men were less resistant to allowing women to work. And we see this too at Nahda, and this is not about prohibiting women from working, rather protecting their future. They perceive that if their daughters work, then they will lose other opportunities such as marriage or other, kind of general acceptance. And so on the one hand, I think, as you pointed out, that we really have to address cultural response to, or kind of cultural views and surrounding women, not only about them working, but where they work and what kind of jobs they should take or they shouldn't take. But also the amazing thing is that with a lot of changes that happened in the last years, or 3 to 5 years, I personally, just anecdotally, have experienced a cultural shift. I've seen a cultural shift, and we're trying to document this and study it as well, and to see how people's perception really is mirroring the political will that we're seeing around us. That with these decisions, that people are also less hesitant about women in leadership and women working. And I see Alessandra actually added her research here. On negotiation, we also saw that through the Takafo survey that women were less likely to negotiate for promotions and for a raise in their salaries. And so what we're trying to do this year is also look at how employers would react to a woman responding, with a woman negotiating, how a man versus a woman negotiating for a promotion or for a raise, what would be the likelihood. We'll share the results hopefully in the next few months, but this is an experiment we're carrying out right now. Thanks, Salma.
Go ahead, Al-Anud. Thank you very much, Jawahar. Go ahead, Al-Anud, please.
Thank you, Salma. I think that my fellow panelists have said everything there is to say on this subject. So I'd like to actually address another question that was presented in the chat, if you allow me. There was a question about how gender equality has been addressed in curriculums, and if it has indeed been addressed in curriculums. And I'd love to hear from you ladies in Saudi Arabia and from Aisha in the UAE. And I love the courageous conversations part, because sometimes it feels like we are having courageous conversations, but no one is listening. And the curriculum issue is something I feel very strongly about, because I did a very small presentation looking at how women are portrayed in our national curriculums in Kuwait, just by looking at some of the second grade materials and how they describe women and men differently, not just in the choice of words, but also in the choice of images. And if I may share one image with you, it was an image of to sort of differentiate between the two genders. It was the picture of a woman was a very young girl, and the picture of a man was a full-grown man with a mustache in a police uniform. So there are these not very subtle, insidious and quite explicit messages that are being fed to both young girls and young boys from a very early age. And the curriculum does not, in fact, reflect the reality of the economic situation in the country, because in most of the scenarios, the mother is at home cooking and the father is out working. And that is certainly not the reality, that these children are living at home. So the curriculums are out of step with the reality. And this is really what needs to change, because as the classes progress, the conversations become very clear about a gender hierarchy where men are placed at the top and women are, of a much lower status. And this becomes problematic when we want to encourage men and women to think of each other as equal or as merit-based, gender neutral, when the curriculum has indoctrinated them for so many years into thinking that men have a added advantage just because of their sex.
Actually, I think the Gender Balance Council in UAE, they are doing a tremendous job. They are working with different states to eliminate all sort of discrimination. I can't talk, of course, on their behalf. They have projects which I'm sure with Ministry of Education in this regard, with the universities as well, and with the curriculum development. But I will speak from the perspective of the HR, since I'm working in this field. I can't comment on their work. But regarding when it comes to HR, I was telling you from the beginning, it was no one should underestimate the importance of just reforming the acts and legislations. This is very important, and the laws, and stated very clearly, these changes need to happen. And we need always to think as team leaders, do we want change or do we want pseudo changes? This question needs to be asked. I think this is very courageous question to be asked. And I keep asking this question, and I keep telling my colleagues as well, my role is to motivate and inspire you guys. You need to do the work. I need to eliminate all sorts of discriminations of any sort of indifferences which can happen in the teams. So we start with simple things. I don't know if that answers your question. I will talk. We are talking about changing the acts and the policies. That was very important. The salary scales, where when it comes to branding issues. Branding issue is sending as well a clear message to the community and the whole world. So we are very careful. There is some sort of guideline as well we are working on when we do the branding. So we make sure it shows that sort of that the balance that we are striking to achieve. I think certain tiny things which happens, such as the branding issue, coming to more complex things which need experimentation and consultation, such as policies. These are very, very important. I don't sense it that much, to be honest with you, Al-Anud. I don't sense it that much. Of course, you're talking to a person. I need to expose my age now. I studied on 80s and on Kuwaiti curriculum. By that time, we used to have Kuwait curriculum. We remember that curriculum very, very well. And now when I'm teaching my children, for example, or reviewing some lessons with them, I don't see it. I have 2 teenagers at home. They have all sorts of arguments you can think of, but nothing based on gender. So I sense it. It is out of now. This is out of upbringing, maybe tarbiyah. That's part of the working environment that I'm living in. So automatically, I'm just bringing this to the house. I don't know, but I don't sense it that much. We hear voices. We see a couple of things here and there, but immediately I think there's some sort of maturity and awareness in the community, and immediately they're rectified.
Thank you very much, Aisha. Rasha?
Thank you. Selma, I'm sure you're going to recognize what I'm about to say. We had a great conversation today, Selma and I think the 2 issues that we're talking about with regards to government regulation is the countries, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, I can only speak for Saudi Arabia, we have huge sweeping legal reforms that are great. And now what needs to happen is they need to trickle down. But once they trickle down, there needs to be an understanding, right? There needs to be an understanding of what is gender reform. Sometimes we have a confusion about what is equitable society or regulations needed for an equitable society, and what is just women gone mad and hating men and so forth. So I think there needs to be a sort of creation of a gendered understanding and how we can work together, and that relates to the laws, but then it also relates to education. So in education itself, I know the Saudi curriculum has gone through many iterations, and lots of pictures have been changed and lots of models of women's activities. So now there are stories for the children that says, my mother drove me to the market, whereas a few years it might have been my father drove me to the market. So these changes are happening, and new ideals for what women can or should be are being portrayed in the curriculum. But I think there is still a further need for definition, for a deeper understanding of what is meant by gender reform or gender sensitive regulations or discussions or so forth. And I think that requires time, and it requires new elements discussing it and new thoughts coming in, and hopefully that will bring about deeper understanding and more sweeping changes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rasha, for that insight as well. And I'll take a few. We have one more comment in the chat from Nicole talking about the importance of mentoring and working with young women in the region, in the Arab-speaking countries, as she describes it, and needing mentorship, support, further education. She also mentions that it's this experience has made her understand that women from that region do not have to compromise the culture and still be leaders. I think that's a great way to bring this session to an end. Thank you very much. We have about 5 minutes before we close, but this has been incredibly insightful. I thank each one of our speakers today, my colleagues at Al-Nahda, our organizer who you do not see a picture of, but she's in the background supporting our work. And as Rasha mentioned, Al-Nahda received ECOSOC status in 2019. We had hoped to host this parallel session in New York, but unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we're utilizing the digital technology and staying closer than ever together. But hopefully, as Al-Anoud said, we get to meet next year in New York, all of us for CSW 66. Thank you very much. This has been a really insightful discussion. I learned a lot, and I leave with many thoughts of what else can be done, but I also am assured that we have leaders in the region who will make this, we will ensure that we have this sustainable movement towards women's empowerment and really tapping into the full potential of the human capital that Isam also mentioned earlier. So thank you all once again. If anybody would like to say any closing remarks, we have about 3 minutes or 4 minutes before we close. So please unmute yourself and any words before we close. Thank you.
I just want to say that to thank you actually, Al-Nahda, for organizing this. I think this is extremely important. This is a dialogue that has to take place. And I'm glad that you're doing it at the GCC level, because there's a lot to be learned from each of the different countries of how they're going about doing things. And one thing I want to mention about the education, I mean, Al-Anoud, you put your point on a very important issue, but the education goes way beyond what you just mentioned. I mean, and it's in all of the GCC, when I talked at the beginning about the human capital and its importance, the education and the learning part of it, and preparing our young generation for the jobs of the future is extremely important, extremely important. So I hope that that this is taken also very seriously and very quickly to just move on that thing. So thank you, Al-Nahda, again. Thank you, Salma, for reaching out, and Rasha and all the teams at Al-Nahda for a great job on this.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Salma, Rasha, Dalal. I don't know if Dalal is listening to us.
Yes, Dalal is the organizer. Dalal is listening. Thank you,
We
Aisha.
had a very hard time in the whole Al-Nahda team. It was a pleasure being with you guys. The very last statement from my end. We always need to challenge the assumptions, philosophies, and traditional ways of thinking and come up with the creative solutions. Pandemic has changed the service of the world. And we need to learn from it. If we don't learn from it now, we will not be able to do anything in the future. I hope to see more women and men as well. So I'm not sensitive towards that issue. I hope to see more women in more unusual positions. I was telling Salma that day, I want to see more women in STEM, I mean, the scientific positions, ministers of finance, maybe ministers of defense. I want to see men as well playing an important role as Minister of Women Affairs. If we reach that status, I will believe by that time that we are really reaching somewhere. And that's something I want to see it in my life. Thank you so much. I learned a lot from all of you, and inshallah, I hope to see you soon. All the best. Thank you.
I just wanted to add my thanks to my fellow panelists, to Al-Nahda, for this nuanced and deeply interesting and provocative session. Thank you, and I hope we see you in real life very soon.
Thank you. I hope we do welcome you in Riyadh also, not only New York. Thank you very much.
Thank you.